In the late 18th century, a widow woman by the name of Jane Ogle and all her children wandered into a little valley on the northern edge of a mountain range in what was then the unsettled eastern part of an area soon to be called Tennessee. Upon arriving, she fashioned a rough house out of the abundant forest timber nearby, cleared a small plot of land to grow food for her family, and erected a barn to store the food she had grown. Being a poor woman and having recently lost her husband, Jane was looking for a place to build a new life without the encumbrances of the New World society. Upon completion of her house and barn, that was all she thought she'd achieved. Jane had no way of knowing at the time that in addition to building a new home, she had also begun building the gateway for what would be 200 years later, the most visited mountain resort area in the entire world. Jane Ogle had commenced building Gatlinburg, Tennessee, the magnificent entrance to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park.
When you was big enough to lift the hoe, you went to hoeing corn. You hoed corn in as long as you lived in the Smokies. I told him if you're big enough to drop your hoe on a weed, that helped a little, didn't it? You had to do something with the kids. You couldn't, Mama had to go hoe corn, everybody, so give the kid a little hoe and let it kill a weed now and then. That's that much.
We worked and we had plenty to eat, but a lot of times we didn't have a lot of things that other people had. Didn't have a lot of money, but we got along well.
You had a big garden and all that.
Had a big garden, and we made everything we ate.
Teaching us to say sit and sit and sat. In the home, we didn't say nary one. We just said sot, and it didn't matter if it's now or a while ago or directly. We still just sot, you know. But things changes so much anymore now. A lot of people don't know the word sot at all. Only if they do, it's applied to some fellas had a little too much to drink, you know. Call him a sot. But then it meant to sit down and rest a spell, don't you know?
If an emergency came up, you blow this horn, no matter where they were at, they came to the house.
The first phone?
Yeah.
Can you still blow that horn?
Took to the land that reminded them of home. The lowland Scots took to the low foothills, the Highland Scots took to the more rugged mountains, and the Rhineland Germans took to the better farmland along the valley floors and along the streams.
Bear skin was the name, but the way them old timers said it, they said bear skin. Now Baskins is a proper name, like Baskin and Robbins, but then it was their way of saying bear skin, because they trapped a lot of bears under them big cliffs up along the Baskins Creek. They'd skin them, bring them off, stretch your hides on the bushes and trees along the creek, you know, and called it Bear Skin Creek. That's how it got its name.
At that time, we didn't have too well a place to, a way of taking care of bear meat, so I ground it up into hamburger, and we cooked it and canned it. But the difference between bear meat and beef, I've often told them, I says, if you find a black hair, more than likely it's bear, and if it's red hair, it's beef, and that's about all of the difference you could tell.
First, I hired about 35 women that wove for me and made towels, and I shipped those everywhere. I bought the material and let them have it on credit. And they'd take the money that I paid them for the towels and go over to my husband's store and spend it for groceries.
Probably the real start was after World War II and people started traveling a little bit. There was gasoline and automobiles and you could get tires and people started to travel. Before that, you know, our tourism was a dozen people coming from Knoxville to get out of the heat and stay in the mountains for a while.
This community goes back to the early 1800s when it was first known as White Oak Flats. because of all the beautiful white oak trees that are here. And it became Gatlinburg about around 1860, and that in and of itself is quite a story. But I do want to also mention that going back, way back about 1,000 years ago, the Cherokee were one of the first people to settle here. And around the late 1700s, there was a man by the name of William Ogle. He was nicknamed Old Billy by his friends, and he came from South Carolina, and he started to hunt and trade with the Cherokee here. You see, all this was part of the hunting preserve of the Cherokees. And when he got to this area, he saw the beautiful trees we have, the mountains, all the streams, and he went back home and he told his wife, Martha Jane, this land here, it's like the promised land in the Bible. It's beautiful. And he decided, I'm going to move my family here. So it was on one of the hunting trips here that he came and he cut down the wood that would be needed for a cabin. He left it to dry and returned to Edgefield to get his family. But that summer, a very bad plague, malaria hit Edgefield. He came down with it and died. So Martha Jane has to decide, I got 7 children. Am I still going to make that trip to the promised land? She decides to come after all. She brings along her children, her brother Peter Husky and his family, and Martha Jane's boys complete that cabin in 1807. And this right here is that original cabin.
Wow.
It was completed in 1807, and it is the oldest structure that we have in Gatlinburg today. What's amazing is these logs, American chestnut, which is no longer a tree we have in this part of the country because of the Chinese chestnut blight. But let's say, Mike, that you lived here. I know you're too young for this, but let's say you were around here in the early 1800s. Fall came and you needed to buy your children some winter shoes. You know what you'd do? You'd oftentimes collect the chestnuts from these trees, take them on into Charlie Ogle's store, and that's what you'd use to buy some winter shoes. Back then, if we had lived in these mountains in the early 1800s, you know, a lot of the people that came here were from Scotland and Ireland. But many came because if they had been a veteran of the American Revolution, they could come here and receive a land grant for a very, very small price. But I just want you to imagine back then, if you and I were here in these mountains, you could look up the mountain ridge and see how the generations of the family settled up the mountain. Let's say you were a granddaddy. You'd have the biggest, the best, and flattest piece of land. Then your children, then the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren. Well, you know, if you were one of those unfortunates at the very, very top of the ridge, you had the hardest time trying to eke out a living on that very rocky, steep land. Mountain people had a special term for that. They called it groundhogging. And you know, there were actually a lot of farmers who fell out of their cornfields and broke an arm or leg in these parts because they were trying to plant corn at a 50-degree angle. But they did have a little folk legend back then. If you were a hard-scrabble farmer at the top of the ridge and you wanted to plant your field, you know the best way to do it?
How would you do it?
Well, you'd get out your old shotgun, get out a bag of seed, walk yourself on over to the opposite hill, and then you would fill that shotgun up with seed and just shoot her across. There's a little shop, the Aerocraft shop, that's one of the oldest shops in Gatlinburg, started in '26, also by the Pi Beta Phi women. And you see, when the teachers came here and started the school, they saw how very, very poor these mountain people were. But they saw the beautiful, beautiful handiwork they could do. The baskets, the weaving, the carving, and sometimes their students would bring them a little gift for their birthday or Christmas. And they said, you know, if we could just provide an outlet for these mountain people's goods, then we could use it to get some dollars back up into those cabins up in the holler. That's why that store was started. The Pi Beta Phi had alumni clubs all across the country, and they would send the mountain people's goods. But also, they made sure that they had a curriculum that was very, very rich in the native Appalachian arts, like weaving and the woodworking and so forth. So we have them to also thank for the rich arts and craft heritage we have here today.
Getting back to the Watson House, how did Dr. Robert Thomas fit into this?
Okay, well, he was the first permanent doctor in Sevier County. He came here in 1926. And originally, it wasn't his purpose to stay that long. He was more like a missionary doctor, but he was going to be here for a little while. But he saw how great the need was for a doctor here. He was very sympathetic toward the mountain people, and he was willing to combine a lot of their faith. He was very sympathetic toward their faith and combining that with the physical healing. And when he came up to these mountains, the one thing he found in the 1920s, that the #1 killer in this area was tuberculosis, which sort of was surprising. You think all this good old clean mountain air.
It is.
But you had, well, the problem was you'd have very, very small cabins, 10 to 12 people living in a 1 or 2 room cabin with a fireplace. And oftentimes that may have not been vented the best. You get a buildup of soot in the logs and so forth, and there were a lot of respiratory problems. But also women back then, it amazed him. Average lifespan of most of the women was around 40 to 45.
How young?
And problem is they would start raising children and having children sometimes in their mid or late teens. And there was a lot of complications, birth complications, and so it wasn't unusual for a man to be married in his lifetime to 2 to 3 different women. And you know, at this clinic, I do have to say, Miss Phyllis, she worked so hard that if she knew somebody was out in the mountains ailing and they couldn't get to her, she wasn't content to wait. She would take her horse Lady and she'd go up to the cabins. And she would help those women. She taught them how to catch babies. That was their term for deliveries. She taught them about screened windows, moving the privy a little further away from the main house, and the need to expand your diet beyond corn 3 times a day. But you know, Mike, I have noticed now that you have this huge, huge wart on your right elbow. It's been plaguing you for months now, hasn't it?
For months.
Well, I'm going to tell you, just, you know, the mountain people had about 100 cures for warts. But don't worry, I know our time's limited. I'm only going to give you one. You know what you need to do to cure that?
Tell me.
Well, you need to go out to your garden, fetch yourself the biggest, fattest onion that you can find, then you rub it back and forth over that wart. You're not done yet. You go back out to your garden and you bury that onion. And by the time that onion has started to decay, guess what's going to happen?
Hopefully the wart's gone.
Exactly. That wart is going to drop off. Well, you've been to your garden, haven't you? It's already gone.
It's gone.
Well, you know, they had also different stories. You could use a dish rag or you could use a potato for getting rid of warts in much the same way. But some of what they did made a lot of good sense. For instance, if someone in the family had had a very bad cut or open wound that was bleeding real badly, very effective thing to put over that was spider webs, because that was a good way to clot the blood. And so they had some folk remedies, and some seemed pretty nonsensical, but there were a lot of them that were very, very good medicine.
And I've heard this too. Weren't a lot of the early settlers a lot of practical jokers that like to play games and tricks on other people?
Exactly, but you know, I think to live in these mountains, it took a very, very good sense of humor.
Yeah.
And it took a lot of ingenuity. There's a little story about Coy Ogle. His family lived on Dudley Creek. And you know, before his mom and dad left, they said, Coy, we want to make sure that you take care of all the ducks and the geese. We don't, you know, we're going to the neighbors now to visit, but you watch them, make sure they don't get in trouble, and make sure that they don't eat any of that corn. Well, as soon as his parents left, he had other ideas in mind because he wanted to play. So you know what he did? He found himself a little twig and he made tiny little sticks that he's propped into each one of those ducks' mouths so they couldn't close it and get into the corn, so he could go play. And I guess I just say that as one example of the tremendous strength and character of the people here and what it took to eke out a living in these mountains. And a lot of determination, a lot of self-reliance. If you couldn't, chances are you couldn't buy it. You made it. But you had to be a jack of all trades in a sense to survive and to succeed in these mountains. And again, we're just able to benefit to see, you know, thank heavens those people stayed and we can live here today because a lot of the sweat and the hard work they put into this area.
Absolutely. We're here at a new location. We're at the White Oaks Flat Cemetery. Kathy, tell us about this cemetery. I know there's got to be a lot of history here. Tell us a little bit about it, please.
It is. Actually, it amazes people when they get up here because a lot of people don't realize that this is here. But there's 600 marked graves here, but we suspect there's about 200 to 300 more people actually buried here where there is no marked grave.
Why is it located right here?
Well, you see, throughout the 1800s and up until about 1950, where the coffee loft is today at light number 6, that was the site of the First Baptist Church of Gatlinburg. And it was very typical back then to have your cemetery adjacent to the church grounds. Now, I should say that back then, most of the mountain people would be referring to this not as a cemetery, but as a corpse yard.
Did they have a lot of folklore and superstitions and different ideas about death? I'm sure they did.
You bet they did. And, you know, you didn't have any funeral homes. You didn't have undertakers or embalmers back then. So the first thing you relied on that church bell, because that's how you were informed of a death in the community. But let's say you were a farmer in your field. You came across a spot in your field where nothing would grow. It's just real patchy. That was considered a very bad omen that someone in your family was going to die within a year. Also, you should never turn a coffin around inside a house. What you should do is take it out the back door and re-enter from the front because it was considered very bad luck to move a coffin or turn it around. Also, a little baby, when it was born, they should not see themselves in a mirror, you know, for the first 6 months of their lives.
Really?
Because if they did, they believed that baby would then die within the next 6 months.
Tell us about some of the more notable or famous people that are actually buried in this graveyard.
Okay. Well, all 5 families are represented, the McCarters, Reagans, Whaleys, Ogles, and Huskies. But we do have the grave of Martha Jane Husky Ogle, the matriarch of the Ogle family. And you know, it's amazing. Up until 1955, 80% of the native Gatlinburg population could still trace its roots back to the Husky or Ogle family.
Who else is buried in here?
Now, further on this way, we have the grave done up in logs of the Roman man of the mountains, known as Wiley Oakley, or the Will Rogers of the Smokies. He was this area's most famous guide. And throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s, he was the man who would guide people like Henry Ford, John D. Rockefeller Jr., Eddie Arnold, any dignitaries from Washington, D.C., and take them on up through these mountains. And his grave is also here. We have David Crockett Maples, who was kinfolk to the original frontiersman, Davy Crockett. And just a lot of history in this area. And I'd really encourage people, if they have a few extra minutes, to come up here because there's so much history. You know, the mountain people often would call these old pieces of stone or slate a grayback. And just some of the etchings on them and the words and stuff are real interesting. You'd also see that a lot of children are buried here because high rates of infant mortality in the early 1900s. And you'd also see a lot of the women who are buried here didn't live very long because of a lot of complications with childbirth.
You know, you mentioned Wiley Oakley. I know you probably have a lot of stories. Tell us maybe a humorous story about him.
Well, you know, toward his later years, he had an outfitter's shop right on the main street of Gatlinburg. And out in front, he had a sign that said, "Antiques, made to order." But that was good old Wiley. Wiley called his wife Mrs. Roman. And one day he had come back from the trail. He was up on Mount LeConte. And he told Mrs. Roman, you know, whenever I'm up on the trail, I'm much more polite to a skunk than I am to any lady. And she said, well, Wiley, that doesn't sound very nice. Why is that true? He said, well, if I'm up there and I see a lady coming, I offer her half the trail. But if I see a skunk a-coming, I offer the entire trail and go all the way around the other side of the mountain. But he wrote 2 books about his adventures in the mountains, Roman and Reston. And then when he was getting on in years and it wasn't so easy to hike those mountain trails anymore, he told one of his tourists if he ever writes any more books, he knows what he's going to call the next 2, Puffin' and Blowin'.
You know, first it was White Oaks Flats, then it was changed to Gatlinburg. How did it get the name Gatlinburg?
Well, just in case you're wondering, it's not because of the Gatlin brothers or the Gatlin gun, because we've had people sometimes think that. But it actually goes back to a Baptist minister from Paw Paw Holler, Tennessee. His name was Radford C. Gatlin, and him and his wife moved here around 1855. Then he opened up a second general store in Gatlinburg, giving Mr. Ogle some competition. And, you know, at the time, Mr. Reagan was the postmaster. And he went to Mr. Reagan and said, I know that you need somewhere to work out of as your post office. If you would like, you could use just a corner of my general store as your station on the condition that the mail that comes in here be addressed to Gatlin's store or Gatlinburg. And it's always stuck, and that's probably why you're not in Oglesville today. Many people, when they left this area, their mountains, so that they could help establish Great Smoky Mountains National Park, you know, many people, I think, gave. It was a very personal sacrifice. And when I talk to different tourists and people that I guide, you seem to sense the sacrifice on the part of the people. And they always comment that when we come to these mountains, we feel we're a part of them, that we're sharing them with someone. And I think it goes back to the people. So many other of our national parks were already in federal hands. And then it became a park, but that is not true of the Smokies. In Tennessee alone, it took over 10 years to buy back all the land because there were 1,200 families living in what would become the park boundary. And it was a hard personal sacrifice. And they didn't, some of them didn't go easy at first, but I do think that people sense that this area here is a gift of the people to the people. Not so much the federal government to the people. And so many people claim, it's like, these mountains, I feel like I'm part of them.
Now, people that are watching that would like to take these tours, how do they go about doing that? How do they get in touch with you or make reservations?
Sure. We have our brochures at the 3 welcome centers and visitor centers here in town, as well as many of the other businesses here. But it is offered through Smoky Mountain Tour Connection, a receptive tour company. They can call 908-9100, or they can stop in. If you're in Gatlinburg, better yet, just stop right in at light number 6 at the Coffee Loft. A wonderful place to stop and have a cool drink, and we leave from there each time, tell you a little bit about Gatlinburg today, then go out in the past. And that's right at the Coffee Loft at light number 6 on the Parkway here in Gatlinburg.
Levi Collins is a man of these mountains, a child of their legacy. Perhaps you'll meet him when you roam in these parts. Levi can catalog his needs in the course of a morning's walk. Health and the grace to enjoy it. A plot of ground for the good things he grows. A roof over his head. And every man needs a sturdy catalog department. Now, with Levi, we can sit for a spell in the sunset of all those yesterdays and gaze back down the pathways we have come along and marvel at the rivers we've spanned, the forests we've left, the campfires we've kept, and the living and the dying we've done to get here. Days do not end in the Great Smoky Mountains. Ages begin. Here is nature in perfect harmony, and man in harmony with himself, with his surroundings, and with the source of them all.